Well, hi everyone. I'm glad to finish off with the last paper. I hope you still have some, your brains are still in action. And as a previous presenter said, I think there are many linkages that I have found also with economic papers and legal papers. For example, the framing from Claire about development and everything, there was a link with every paper. What I'm presenting today is a paper that I wrote together with Jan, who is a chair of the previous panel. We're still thinking about a more appealing title, so if you have any ideas, you can share them with us. And I will try to keep our presentation short because we are really trying to finalize the paper and we are really looking for feedback, so just shoot it afterwards. Now, the presentation is structured on, I will do 3 things. So I will tell you that we have noticed in our research that there is really a rise in labor provisions in EU trade agreements. And in the second part, we will look at the explanations. How can we explain this? Because this is actually counterintuitive. And the most obvious culprit is protectionism, but that's not the case. We don't see that at all. What we propose as the explanation is that social trade has become an unobjectionable norm within the EU. No one can oppose it anymore, or no one wants to oppose it even. And then thirdly, we will conclude with some thoughts for further research and also about this evolution. So what you actually see, we started looking at EU trade agreements from the 1990s onwards until today. So I think the last agreement was Canada, and we also looked at these provisions. And you see that there is a rise. In this period there is a rise, steadily, but in this period there is really a boom of labor provisions in these trade agreements. Now, why do we say there is a boom? There is a boom on 3 levels: on the scope, the enforceability, and the governance. Now, what is all of this? Here you see our table. I won't go into all of the details of all the crosses. We have an explanation for that in another paper we wrote. But if you look at the scope, first there were some social policy norms. For example, if a Moroccan worker would come to the EU, he should have the same social security benefits and so on, so more technical social norms. But then you have ILO core labor standards included in all the agreements. With regard to enforceability, if there is a dispute, firstly only governments could discuss these issues, but now there is a panel of experts which would make it more transparent, more objective, so the enforceability has also increased. And then thirdly, what we call governance has also increased. So now, via CSR, companies are involved in promoting and abiding by social standards. And also civil society has now a role in monitoring the labor provisions. So, for example, in Korea, the civil society of 2 sides, they meet once a year and they discuss, or they should meet once a year, and they discuss how labor standards are abided by within the trade agreements. So there is really a much stronger social ambition. This increased social ambition, however, is within a cooperative approach. So the EU is known for not, if you oppose it to the US approach, which is seen as a hard approach, the EU is actually really, I had a word in my head, but I'm not going to say it. But it's really like a soft actor, and this is really always seen as negative. But I will come back to this. Because actually, we think that this is not as soft as it is presented always, for actually 4 reasons. So the US is seen as hard. If you look at the trade agreements, yes, but if you look at the practice, they are not hard at all. There have never been any enforcement of these labor standards. So actually this dichotomy is in practice totally false. And secondly, we think that the long-term impact of these new provisions in trade agreements, they cannot be underestimated. For example, civil society of both sides can learn from each other. They have maybe new ways to ask their government for better labor provisions and so on, transnational advocacy building. Thirdly, also, it might seem innocent, such a civil society forum, and indeed it might be like an empty shelf, like an empty box, but for example, Cariforum, and Adrian has written about this, there has been a lot of reluctance to set this up. Also in the Korea Civil Society Forum, the government didn't want to include both of the main trade unions, so the governments really are a bit afraid of this, so I think it shows that it is important. And fourthly, actually, these labor provisions are enforceable. So they are soft, but if you see them as human rights, they can also be enforced via the Essential Elements Clause. So all these 4 points are to prove that there really is an increased social ambition. Of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we have to see in practice how this all evolves. It all depends on the political context within the EU, within the trade partner countries. If we have another Lamy as a trade commissioner coming, for example, it might be totally different than under Karel de Gucht. We don't know what Malmström is going to do. Also, the civil society forum meetings. Yeah, how are they going to go? How is the government going to respond to what civil society says about labor provisions? Now, going to the second part, how can we explain this increased social ambition? Because there was always, it has always been assumed that center-right governments were actually against a social clause, but then because of in Germany and France and the UK, there were more left-wing governments coming up. They stimulated, and also the European Parliament, they stimulated to have a social clause, so suddenly it was in there. But how can we then explain that in the middle of the 2000s, where there was more right-wing governments within the EU and also within the Parliament, how can we then explain that social ambition has increased so much? And also, if you look at the Global Europe Trade Strategy, I think a lot of people have talked about this already, it's really to liberalize, and so-called non-trade issues, they are put to the sidelines. If you read the Global Europe Strategy, you see it very clearly. So this is at first we couldn't really explain this. And the most obvious culprit is protectionism. You would think that, also because of the crisis, that Europe would like to use this social clause as a means to block products from so-called countries where labor standards are not abided by. But that's totally, Europe isn't protectionist, not at all. You don't see it in discourse, and you don't see it in the actions. In discourse, if you read speeches from trade commissioners, if you read also the trade agreements themselves, there is explicitly said that labor standards, the lowering of labor standards, should not be used for protectionist motives, and so on. And yeah, also in actions, you don't see that there haven't been any protectionist actions because of labor standards. Also in the GSP, this hasn't been the case. So how can we then explain it? Well, we argue for a more normative explanation. We argue that the core labor standards and the whole social clause has become an unobjectionable norm. And we use a framework of Finnemore and Seeking and Elström, who has built on that. And they actually say that there are two phases. So there is a norm that emerges and that is taken up by norm entrepreneurs. For example, the European Parliament and Belgium, they were really fighting for the social clause to get this into trade agreements. And then in the second phase, once it is there, it becomes socialized. It's repeated in other trade agreements, it is in the discourse, it is in policy documents. And if you look at our paper, you will see that really, that you notice it everywhere, that this norm is penetrating everything, all the trade documents and so on. So we argue, yeah, social trade is here to stay. It cannot just, for us it would be unimaginable if there would be a trade agreement without the social norms. And these are some reasons that we list up. It is not as politicized anymore, the social clause in the EU, as it used to be before. The path dependency, once you write it in there, how can you not write it in another agreement? There's also public demand for it and support. Think about the Colombia trade agreement, for example. Imagine that they wouldn't have put core labor standards in there. But also, and this is something we are a bit struggling with, I mean, it is reframed as sustainable development. So first, these social rights were put there as technical norms, then more as human rights. And now they are in a chapter of sustainable development. So this means that, as I said before, that environmental norms and social rights are put under the same heading. And this makes it more acceptable for people who are not very much in favor of the social clause, but it might also be more acceptable for third countries. For example, India. They were very much against a social clause in the WTO, but because it's on the same level as environmental standards, it might be more acceptable. I mean, who can be against sustainable development? So to conclude, I hope we have proven that the social clause in EU trade agreements has become more ambitious, and over time it has been reframed actually from market-related technical norms to human rights and then to sustainable development. And this is on the one hand brilliant, because everyone can now be in favor of this social clause, but it's also dangerous, and if, there's also a legal analysis from Martels on this. Yeah, because social rights are now under the essential elements clause, but they are, for example, also in the sustainable development chapter. What are you going to do if there is a dispute? Are you going to complain under the sustainable development clause, or are you going to do it in the essential elements clause? And it takes away the human rights aspect of social rights. But so all of this is actually a danger, but we don't know yet how it is going to evolve in practice. It could be that the social ambition is there on paper, but it will not be used, or this could really be more venues for contestation from civil society and so on. So yeah, thank you, and I hope to get some comments.